It was a cold autumn morning when Richard, a wealthy businessman, returned home earlier than usual. His company had just signed a deal worth millions, and while his colleagues went out to celebrate, he longed for something quieter. As he stepped inside his grand mansion, the faint hum of a song drifted through the air. It wasn't unusual to hear sounds of cleaning, the clatter of dishes, the swish of a mop, or the rustle of dusting. But this sound was different. It was gentle, filled with emotion, almost trembling with something deeper than a simple tune. Richard paused, his expensive shoes silent on the marble floor, as he followed the voice upstairs. The door to his daughter's room was slightly open. He expected to see Maria, the maid, busy folding clothes or vacuuming the carpet. But what he saw when he pushed the door open made him freeze in place. Maria wasn't cleaning. She was kneeling beside his daughter Emily, who was in her wheelchair. The girl's eyes, usually clouded with sadness, were sparkling with life. Emily was laughing, a sound Richard hadn't heard in so long that it felt almost foreign. Maria had placed a scarf on her head, pretending to be a princess, and Emily was clapping her hands, giggling with delight. They weren't just maid and employer's daughter, they were two souls sharing joy in a world where loneliness had taken root. For years, Richard had poured all his energy into building his empire. After his wife passed away, he drowned himself in work, convincing himself that money could cover the cracks in their lives. Emily had grown up surrounded by luxury but not by warmth. She had her tutors, her nurses, her toys, but none of them filled the silence in her heart. And now, here was Maria, a woman who earned a fraction of what Richard spent on his morning coffee, giving Emily something priceless: companionship and love. At first, Richard felt conflicted. How could his daughter find joy with someone outside their world, someone hired to serve? But as he watched, his heart softened. Maria lifted Emily from the wheelchair with surprising strength and spun her gently around, careful but filled with care. Emily's laughter rang through the room like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the sound of Emily's laughter echoing in his mind. He realized it wasn't just Maria's presence. It was the way she saw Emily, not as a burden, not as a child defined by her disability, but as a little girl deserving of joy. Something Richard, in his grief and ambition, had forgotten. The next morning, Richard called Maria into his study. She looked nervous, expecting perhaps to be scolded for not working properly. Instead, Richard asked her to sit. He struggled for words, the kind that didn't come from boardrooms or business deals. "Yesterday," he finally said, his voice heavy, "I saw something I haven't seen in years. My daughter's smile. Tell me, Maria, how do you do it?" Maria's eyes softened. She spoke quietly. "Sir, Emily doesn't need more things. She needs more time, more laughter, more love. I just give her what every child wants, to be seen." Those words cut deep into Richard's heart. For the first time, he realized how blind he had been. He had thought his role as a father was fulfilled by providing wealth and security. But Maria was right. What Emily craved most was not gifts but presence. From that day forward, Richard began to change. At first, it was awkward. He didn't know how to connect, how to step into a world of childlike wonder that he had long abandoned. But Maria guided him, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly. She encouraged him to read Emily bedtime stories, to take her on small outings, to simply sit with her and listen. There were challenges. Richard's demanding work often clashed with his newfound commitment to fatherhood. Old habits pulled him back toward endless meetings and late nights at the office. But every time he heard Emily's laughter, every time he saw her eyes light up when he walked into the room, he found the strength to resist. Slowly, the walls around his heart began to crumble. Maria too faced struggles. She had her own family far away, whom she supported with her modest salary. Balancing her responsibilities at home and her devotion to Emily was not easy. But what kept her going was the belief that her work was more than just employment. It was a calling. Over time, something extraordinary happened. Emily's health, though fragile, began to improve. Her doctors noted her brighter spirit, her renewed will to live. It wasn't medicine alone that made the difference. It was hope. Hope born from love, laughter, and the simple act of being truly seen. One evening, Richard sat by Emily's bedside as she drifted off to sleep. She clutched his hand tightly and whispered, "Daddy, I'm happy now." Tears filled his eyes. For years, he had been chasing numbers on a screen, while the real treasure, the smile of his daughter, was right here at home. Richard looked at Maria, standing quietly in the doorway. He realized that the maid he once overlooked had given him back his daughter's joy, and in doing so, had given him back his own heart. The story of Richard, Emily, and Maria is not just about wealth or loss. It's about rediscovery. It's about realizing that love doesn't come from riches or power, but from simple acts of kindness. It's about opening our eyes to the people we often take for granted, for sometimes the ones we least expect carry the power to change everything. Richard had always lived in a world of structure, precision, and control. As a wealthy businessman, every detail of his life was mapped out with exactness: meetings, contracts, negotiations, and investments. Nothing surprised him anymore, because he believed he had seen it all. But life has a strange way of humbling even the most confident souls. That morning, he arrived home earlier than anyone expected. His driver was shocked when Richard canceled his lunch meeting, his assistant confused when he postponed all appointments, and even the staff at his mansion whispered quietly, wondering what could have brought him back so soon. Richard himself didn't have a clear answer. All he knew was that the noisy celebrations of success felt strangely hollow, and the quiet of his home beckoned him more than champagne and toasts. The moment he stepped into the grand marble hallway, he noticed something unusual. His home was always filled with the faint noises of chores: vacuum cleaners humming, dishes clinking, or the soft shuffle of maids tidying up. But today, what caught his ear was different. It wasn't the sound of labor but of melody. A voice, tender and almost hesitant, floated down the staircase. It was singing, not with professional polish, but with the rawness of emotion. Richard frowned, curiosity overtaking him, and he slowly climbed the stairs, his footsteps careful, as though he were intruding on something sacred. As he approached the half-open door of his daughter Emily's room, the sound grew clearer. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard laughter from that room in so long. Emily had been born with a condition that left her unable to walk, and while she had everything money could buy, doctors, treatments, toys, she rarely smiled. After his wife's passing, Richard had buried himself in work, convincing himself that financial security was the greatest gift he could give his daughter. Yet in the process, the light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a heaviness far too great for a child. But what Richard saw through that doorway shook him to his core. Maria, the maid he had always regarded as invisible background to his household, was not dusting shelves or folding laundry. She was kneeling on the floor, a scarf draped over her head, pretending to be a princess in some imaginary game. Emily sat in her wheelchair, her face glowing with joy, clapping her hands in excitement. Her giggles rang out like bells, rich and alive, filling the room with warmth. It was a sound so foreign to Richard now that it nearly made his chest ache. Maria twirled dramatically, pretending to trip over her own dress, sending Emily into a fit of laughter so uncontrollable that she covered her mouth with her small hands. Richard stood frozen, the scene before him piercing his soul. He had forgotten what his daughter's happiness looked like. He had forgotten the sound of her laughter, the sparkle of her eyes. He realized then how much time had slipped through his fingers, how much he had missed while chasing wealth and accolades. The sight stirred emotions he had long buried. Memories of his late wife flooded back, her patience, her warmth, the way she used to cradle Emily and whisper stories to her until she fell asleep. He remembered how she had begged him to slow down, to spend more time with their daughter, but he had always dismissed her, saying he was building a future for them. And now, standing in the doorway, Richard couldn't help but wonder if he had built an empire at the cost of his own child's joy. As he continued to watch, he noticed the gentleness in Maria's eyes. She looked at Emily not with pity but with love. Every movement was careful, thoughtful, filled with sincerity. She wasn't just entertaining the child. She was connecting with her soul, offering her the kind of affection and attention that Richard hadn't given in years. Maria's laughter blended with Emily's, creating a harmony that transformed the atmosphere of the room. It was no longer just a bedroom in a mansion. It was a sanctuary of joy. Richard's throat tightened as he realized how wrong he had been about Maria. To him, she had always been just a maid, someone who swept floors and polished furniture. But in that moment, she was so much more. She was a healer of hearts, a giver of hope, a bridge between despair and laughter. He had underestimated her, overlooked her humanity, and dismissed her presence. Yet here she was giving his daughter something he could never buy. Time seemed to slow as Richard stood there, torn between stepping inside and letting the moment unfold untouched. He felt like an intruder in his own home, witnessing a truth that both humbled and shamed him. For all his power and influence, he had failed at the most basic duty of a father, to make his child feel loved. And it was Maria, the one person he had never truly seen, who had succeeded where he had failed. The longer he watched, the heavier his chest became. He could no longer ignore the reality staring him in the face. His daughter did not need another toy, another luxurious vacation, or another trust fund. She needed presence. She needed laughter. She needed moments like these, moments he had denied her by hiding behind work. The empire he built suddenly felt small compared to the richness of the simple scene unfolding before his eyes. In that instant, Richard understood something profound. Life had given him everything he thought mattered, but it had taken a maid's kindness to show him what truly did. He realized that joy doesn't come wrapped in wealth or status. It comes in the form of love, connection, and simple human kindness. And as he quietly closed the door, retreating to let Emily and Maria continue their world of laughter and imagination, his heart carried a weight he had never felt before. Maria had come to the mansion years ago, carrying with her a quiet determination to provide for her family back home. She was never one to draw attention to herself. Her days were spent in silence, sweeping floors, polishing silverware, preparing rooms, and making sure everything was spotless before Richard returned from work. No one ever asked her about her dreams, her struggles, or the family she worked so hard to support. To the world inside that mansion, she was simply the maid. But to Emily, she had slowly become something else, something far more valuable than anyone realized. It began in small, almost invisible ways. One afternoon, while tidying Emily's room, Maria noticed the little girl staring out the window, her eyes heavy with loneliness. She tried speaking softly to her, but Emily rarely responded. Still, Maria didn't give up. The next day, she hummed while folding laundry, and she caught a flicker of curiosity in Emily's eyes. Soon, humming turned to gentle singing, and the singing turned into stories told in a playful voice while she worked. Emily, who had been so quiet for so long, began to smile, then laugh, and eventually talk back. Maria understood something about Emily that no amount of medical training or expensive therapy had managed to grasp. What the little girl needed most wasn't more treatment, but companionship. She needed someone to step into her world, to play with her, to remind her that she was more than her wheelchair. So, Maria took it upon herself to do just that. When she cleaned, she made games out of it, pretending the mop was a magic wand or the dusting cloth was part of a royal cape. When she cooked in the kitchen, she'd sneak a cookie upstairs to share with Emily as though it were a grand secret between them. These small acts weren't written in her job description, but Maria's heart didn't operate on instructions. It operated on love. Over time, Emily's room transformed from a place of silence into a space filled with imagination. Where once there had been only medical equipment and quiet despair, now there were stories of princesses, knights, and magical lands spun from Maria's creativity. She found ways to involve Emily in every game. If Emily couldn't run, Maria made her the queen who commanded adventures. If she couldn't dance, Maria would dance for her, spinning until they both laughed so hard they could barely breathe. For the first time in years, Emily didn't feel confined by her chair. She felt free in the world Maria built around her. This bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Emily began waiting eagerly for Maria to come into her room. The sound of the maid's footsteps in the hallway was enough to light up her face. Maria became more than a helper. She became her confidant, her playmate, her source of joy. It wasn't just about entertainment. Maria gave Emily something deeper. She made her feel seen, valued, and loved for who she was, not for what she lacked. There were moments when Emily would share things she never told anyone else. She confided in Maria about missing her mother, about wishing her father would spend more time with her, about the loneliness that sometimes felt unbearable. Maria listened without judgment, offering comfort not in grand speeches but in quiet reassurances, gentle hugs, and the simple act of being fully present. For a child who had grown used to being surrounded by people who looked after her physical needs but rarely touched her emotional ones, this attention was life-changing. Maria's presence didn't just affect Emily. It changed the atmosphere of the household. Other staff members began noticing Emily's brighter spirit. The nurses reported improvements in her energy, her appetite, and even her willingness to engage in therapy sessions. The child who once dreaded each day now looked forward to them, all because Maria had chosen to step beyond her duties. Yet Maria's efforts weren't without challenges. She worked long hours, often pushing herself past exhaustion. There were days when her own heart ached from missing her children back home, days when the weight of responsibility nearly crushed her. But whenever she saw Emily's face light up with laughter, she found renewed strength. She believed that love wasn't divided when shared, it multiplied. And in giving Emily joy, she too found purpose and healing for her own struggles. The transformation wasn't immediate or magical. It was gradual, built brick by brick through consistent care and compassion. But by the time Richard stumbled upon them that day, the foundation was already strong. What he witnessed was not a fleeting moment of play, but the result of countless hours Maria had invested into bringing light back into Emily's world. Maria never sought recognition for what she did. She didn't tell Richard how many nights she stayed up comforting Emily during storms, or how many times she carried her around the room so she could feel what it was like to be lifted beyond her chair. She never mentioned the songs she made up just to make Emily laugh, or the prayers she whispered over the little girl while tucking her into bed. To Maria, this was not about praise. It was about love. The beauty of Maria's role was that it was invisible until someone truly looked. To most, she blended into the background of the household, moving quietly from room to room. But in the life of Emily, she was a central figure, a lifeline. She had taught the girl that even in a world of pain and loss, joy was still possible. She had shown her that love doesn't always come from where we expect it. Sometimes, it comes from those we least notice. Her presence gave Emily more than laughter. It gave her resilience. The little girl began to face her challenges with courage, because someone believed in her. She no longer felt like a fragile child hidden behind wealth and medical care. With Maria by her side, she felt like a person of worth, capable of dreaming, laughing, and living fully despite her limitations. What Richard saw that day was only the surface of what Maria had built. Behind the laughter, there was a history of care, sacrifice, and small acts of kindness that had slowly changed everything. She had done what money could not. She had restored life to a child who had forgotten how to feel alive. Richard had always measured his worth in numbers. Profits, investments, assets, his life revolved around figures written on paper and flashing across computer screens. To him, these numbers meant stability, legacy, and security for his family. But as he stood in the hallway outside Emily's room, listening to her laughter ripple through the air, he began to feel a weight pressing against the walls of his heart. For the first time in years, he wondered if all the money in the world could ever replace what he had just witnessed. Wealth had been his shield ever since his wife's passing. He couldn't bear the silence in the house, the emptiness that seemed to echo in every corner, so he filled it with work. He told himself he was being a good father by building an empire, by ensuring Emily would never have to struggle for anything. He hired the best doctors, the most skilled nurses, the most expensive therapists. He filled her room with toys and gadgets that other children could only dream of. Yet none of it had managed to put that sparkle in her eyes. None of it had coaxed laughter from her lips the way Maria's simple presence had. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the shelves lined with awards, certificates, and framed photographs of company milestones. Each one told the story of his achievements, of his climb to the top, but none of them reflected the story of Emily's happiness. He felt an emptiness gnawing at him, one that no deal or investment could fill. He realized that for all his wealth, he had been poor in the things that mattered most. The next morning, when he called Maria into his study, his pride made it difficult to speak. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who spoke with authority in front of hundreds, yet in front of this quiet maid, he felt stripped of his usual confidence. He confessed what he had seen, admitted that it had shaken him, and asked her how she had managed to bring Emily back to life. Maria's answer was simple yet profound. She told him that Emily didn't need more things. She needed more love, more presence, more laughter. Richard sat there stunned, realizing the truth of her words. For years, he had been giving his daughter everything except the one thing she longed for, his time. It wasn't an easy realization to accept. For a man who had always believed that money could solve every problem, it was humbling to acknowledge that the most important currency in his daughter's life was love. He thought about all the times he had brushed her off with promises of later. All the times he had returned home too late to read her a bedtime story. All the birthdays where his gifts were extravagant but his presence was absent. Each memory stung like a wound reopening, and guilt began to weigh heavily on him. From that day forward, Richard began to make changes, small at first but significant. He canceled a meeting to be home for dinner. He set aside his phone when he sat with Emily, forcing himself to listen when she spoke instead of letting his mind wander back to business deals. He struggled at first, fumbling with the idea of storytelling or games, but Maria guided him gently. She encouraged him to read aloud to Emily, to take her outside for short walks in the garden, to let her teach him the little things she had learned with her tutors. Slowly, Richard found himself slipping into a world he had almost forgotten. A world where his daughter's smile was worth more than any profit margin. There were setbacks, of course. Old habits die hard, And there were times when he felt the pull of work stronger than his desire to stay home. Contracts still needed signing, investors still demanded his attention, and crises still erupted at inconvenient times. But every time he heard Emily laugh, every time her eyes lit up when she saw him, he found the strength to push back against the demands of his empire. It was as if he was learning to breathe again, not just for himself, but for her. The more time he spent with Emily, the more he realized how little she cared about the things he thought mattered. She didn't talk about the expensive toys or the grand vacations. What she cherished were the moments when he was simply there. The times he sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to her stories, playing silly games, or laughing at Maria's antics. It wasn't about wealth. It was about presence, and for the first time, Richard began to understand that being a father was not something you could outsource. This realization transformed not just his relationship with Emily but his view of life itself. He started to see the emptiness in his relentless pursuit of success. What good were towering buildings and millions in the bank if the one person who mattered most grew up feeling unseen and unloved? He began to recognize the irony of his life, that he had been building an empire while neglecting the kingdom of love in his own home. Maria's words continued to echo in his heart. Love was not measured in gifts but in moments. Laughter was not bought but created. Joy was not found in possessions but in people. Slowly, Richard began to release the grip money had over him. He still worked, still managed his business, but it no longer consumed him the way it once did. For the first time, he learned to balance, to prioritize, to live not just for wealth but for love. Emily noticed the difference. She no longer waited for Maria alone. She began waiting for her father, too. She asked him to join in their games, to be part of their stories, to share in the laughter. And though he often stumbled, though he sometimes felt clumsy and unsure, his effort was what mattered most to her. Her heart, once weighed down with loneliness, began to heal. Richard also noticed changes within himself. The man who had once been defined by his titles and achievements now found meaning in simple things. His daughter's smile, her laughter, her quiet, "I love you," whispered before bed. These moments filled a void he hadn't even realized existed, a void money had never been able to touch. He came to understand that true wealth wasn't in his bank account, but in the bond he shared with his daughter. All the luxuries he had chased paled in comparison to the joy of hearing Emily laugh freely, the joy of knowing he had finally given her something no one else could. His heart. And in that realization, Richard discovered that while money could build a mansion, only love could make it a home. Richard's journey into fatherhood was never meant to be walked alone. When his wife was alive, she was the balance to his ambition, the softness to his hard edges. She reminded him to slow down, to see the beauty in small things, to be present with their daughter. But after she passed away, Richard lost that balance completely. Grief clouded his vision, and instead of turning toward Emily, he turned toward his work. The office became his escape, a place where the pain of loss could be dulled by contracts, meetings, and numbers. He told himself he was doing it for Emily, that his absence was justified because he was building a future for her. But in reality, he was hiding, afraid of facing the silence at home, afraid of seeing the reflection of his late wife in his daughter's eyes. As years passed, Richard became a man divided. On one side was the image of a powerful businessman, respected and admired for his relentless drive. On the other was the broken father who didn't know how to connect with the little girl waiting for him at home. This internal conflict created a heavy burden, one that Richard didn't even realize he was carrying until the day he saw Maria and Emily together. That moment shook him because it confronted him with the truth he had been avoiding. His daughter didn't just miss her mother, she missed her father too. Balancing work, grief, and fatherhood was not a simple task. At first, Richard didn't even know where to begin. His life had been built around a strict schedule: early mornings, endless meetings, late nights. His phone never stopped buzzing, his calendar never stopped filling, and stepping away felt like risking everything he had worked for. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether the empire he had built was worth the cost of his daughter's happiness. When he began trying to spend more time at home, the struggle was immediate. He felt awkward around Emily, as though he were a guest in his own daughter's life. He didn't know what to say to her, how to play with her, or how to make her laugh the way Maria did. Every attempt felt forced, and every silence between them reminded him of how much time he had already lost. Sometimes he retreated back to his study, convincing himself that he wasn't needed. But then he would hear Emily's laughter with Maria, and the sound would pull him back, whispering to him that it wasn't too late if only he tried harder. Grief still haunted him. There were nights when he sat by himself, holding a photograph of his wife, wondering if she would be proud of the father he had become. He thought of her voice urging him to read bedtime stories, to play simple games, to just be there. He realized with painful clarity that she had understood something he never did. Children don't measure love in money, they measure it in moments. And now, he was left to learn that lesson without her guidance, stumbling his way through mistakes and regrets. Emily, too, carried her own grief. She had lost her mother at a young age and had grown used to her father's absence. She didn't expect him to be part of her daily life anymore. So when he began trying, she was hesitant. She watched him with cautious eyes, unsure if his presence was permanent or temporary. There were times she even pushed him away, retreating into the safety of her bond with Maria. Richard had to learn patience, to earn back her trust not with grand gestures but with consistency. The world outside their home made the struggle even harder. Investors questioned his new boundaries. Colleagues frowned when he turned down late night meetings, and competitors whispered about his slowing pace. For a man who had built his reputation on relentless ambition, it was humbling to be seen as less available. The temptation to dive back into his old habits was always there, pressing against him like a tide. But every time he considered it, he thought of Emily's laughter, of her fragile trust, and he chose differently. Maria became a quiet guide during this transition. She never lectured Richard or made him feel guilty. Instead, she offered small suggestions, gentle encouragements, and simple examples of how to connect with Emily. She reminded him that it wasn't about doing something extraordinary, but about being present in ordinary moments. A story before bed, a walk in the garden, a meal shared at the same table. Each of these little acts slowly began to rebuild the bond that had been broken. Still, there were days when Richard failed. There were evenings when work pulled him away, mornings when stress made him impatient, and moments when his old habits crept back in. Each time, guilt weighed on him, but he refused to let failure define him. He learned to apologize to Emily, to admit when he was wrong, to show her that even fathers make mistakes. In doing so, he discovered that vulnerability was not weakness, but a bridge, a way to connect with his daughter more deeply. The challenge of balancing everything also reshaped Richard as a leader. He began to see that success at work meant nothing if it came at the expense of family. He started to delegate more, to trust others, to let go of the illusion that he had to control everything. Ironically, this shift made him a better businessman. But more importantly, it gave him the space to be a father. As he continued on this path, Richard realized that grief would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to control him. Instead of letting it push him into isolation, he began to use it as a reminder of what truly mattered. He knew his wife would have wanted him to love Emily with all his heart, to fill the gaps her absence had left with presence, not with money. That thought gave him strength on days when the balance seemed impossible. In the end, the struggle of balancing work, grief, and fatherhood wasn't something Richard conquered once and for all. It was a daily choice, a constant battle between the demands of the world and the needs of his daughter. Some days he succeeded, other days he stumbled, but each step brought him closer to the kind of father Emily deserved. It was a journey not of perfection, but of persistence, a journey that taught him that true strength wasn't found in boardrooms but in bedtime stories, not in contracts but in quiet laughter, not in wealth but in love. Maria's life was not an easy one. Long before she ever stepped into Richard's mansion, she had already carried burdens that would have broken many others. She came from a small town where opportunities were scarce, and like many women in her situation, she made the difficult choice to leave her own children behind so she could work and provide for them. Every morning when she woke up, her first thoughts were of her family. Her elderly mother who needed medicine, her children who needed school fees, her siblings who depended on her for support. Her job as a maid wasn't glamorous, but it was her lifeline, the only way she could keep her loved ones fed and safe. Despite the hardships, Maria carried herself with quiet strength. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and never showed the weight she bore inside. To most of the household staff, she was just another maid, blending into the background, completing her duties without fuss. But beneath that quiet exterior was a woman who knew the true meaning of sacrifice. Every paycheck she received was sent home almost entirely, with little left for herself. She lived simply, sometimes skipping meals so that her children wouldn't have to, sometimes enduring loneliness so that her family could feel secure. When she met Emily, something inside Maria shifted. At first, She saw only a child confined to a wheelchair, withdrawn and quiet. But as she spent more time in the mansion, she began to see past the disability and the wealth that surrounded Emily. She saw a little girl who was hurting, a child who missed her mother, who longed for her father's presence, who carried loneliness far heavier than any physical condition. In Emily, Maria recognized the same ache she felt in her own heart, the ache of being separated from those you loved most. That recognition became the foundation of their bond. Maria never set out to become Emily's companion, but it happened naturally. Her compassion drove her to fill the void she sensed. She didn't need training to know that what Emily longed for wasn't more doctors or toys, but attention, laughter, and love. So Maria began to step beyond her duties, telling her stories, making her laugh, turning ordinary chores into moments of joy. It wasn't part of her job description, but to Maria, it was simply what her heart told her to do. Her sacrifices went unnoticed by most. Few knew about the long nights when Emily cried herself to sleep, and Maria stayed by her side, singing softly until she drifted off. Few knew about the mornings when she carried Emily from her bed to the window so she could feel the sun on her face, even though Maria's back ached from years of labor. Few knew about the times she spent her own money to buy small trinkets or treats just to see Emily smile. Maria didn't do these things for recognition. She did them because she couldn't bear to see the child suffer alone. There were days when Maria's responsibilities pulled her in two directions. She missed her own children deeply, often wondering if they felt the same loneliness Emily felt. She longed to hold them, to hear their laughter, to watch them grow. The thought that she was missing their milestones weighed heavily on her. Yet she also knew that her sacrifices were giving them opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. That duality, being both present for Emily while absent for her own children, was one of the hardest challenges she carried. What made Maria extraordinary was the way she gave of herself even when she had so little left to give. Her strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, patient, and enduring. She became a pillar not only for Emily but unknowingly for Richard as well. Though he didn't realize it at first, Maria's example showed him what true love and devotion looked like. She never lectured him or criticized him for his absence as a father. Instead, she lived her values in quiet ways, proving through her actions that presence and compassion mattered more than wealth. Even when she faced exhaustion, Maria found purpose in Emily's smile. It became her reward, her reassurance that the sacrifices she made were worth it. Every time Emily laughed, Maria felt a spark of hope not only for the child but for herself as well. It was as if bringing joy to Emily gave her the strength to continue her own journey, to keep pushing forward despite her own struggles. Maria also endured challenges within the household. Some staff members whispered about her closeness to Emily, questioning why she went beyond her duties. Others thought she was trying too hard to impress Richard. Though nothing could be further from the truth, these rumors stung, but Maria never let them stop her. She knew her intentions were pure, and she refused to let gossip stand in the way of what she believed was right. Her quiet resilience silenced her critics over time as they saw the undeniable impact she had on Emily's spirit. Her sacrifices extended beyond emotional labor. There were months when she sent home more money than she could afford, leaving herself with barely enough to get by. She denied herself new clothes, good meals, or even rest, choosing instead to stretch every ounce of her energy and every coin she earned for the sake of others. Yet she never allowed bitterness to take root in her heart. Instead, she saw her sacrifices as an expression of love, both for her own family and for the little girl who had come to see her as more than a maid. Maria's strength was not about perfection but about endurance. She wasn't free from fear, doubt, or weariness. There were nights when she cried quietly in her room, longing for the embrace of her own children, wondering if they would one day understand why she had to leave. But each morning, she rose again with determination, putting her pain aside to offer joy to Emily. That ability to keep giving despite her own emptiness was what made her remarkable. Her sacrifices shaped the entire household in ways no one could ignore. Emily began to heal emotionally, her laughter returning, her eyes shining brighter. Richard began to awaken to the truth he had been blind to for years, realizing through Maria's actions that love was the greatest gift he could give his daughter. And even the other staff members began to see her differently, respecting her quiet devotion and the way she carried herself with dignity. Maria's story is one of countless unsung heroes who give of themselves daily, often unnoticed, often unappreciated, yet profoundly impactful. She was more than just a maid. She was a woman of courage, sacrifice, and unshakable strength. Through her sacrifices and quiet strength, she became the bridge between loneliness and love, despair and hope, absence and presence. She gave Emily more than joy. She gave her the sense of being cherished, and in doing so, she changed not only Emily's life but Richard's as well. Richard had always thought of himself as a man in control. He controlled his business, his time, his money, and his reputation. People looked at him with respect because he had everything most men desired. But the truth that began to unfold inside his own home humbled him in a way nothing else ever could. What he saw in the bond between Maria and Emily forced him to confront the emptiness inside himself. For years, he believed that his love for his daughter was enough because he worked hard to provide. He mistook provision for presence, wealth for warmth, and gifts for love. Yet standing in the doorway of Emily's room that day was the beginning of a transformation he didn't even know he needed. At first, change did not come easily. Richard had lived so long with walls around his heart that lowering them felt unnatural. He was used to boardrooms where emotions were seen as weakness, where vulnerability was exploited, where strength was measured in power. But at home, in the presence of his daughter, he was faced with a new definition of strength. It wasn't in dominating a meeting or closing a deal. It was in kneeling on the floor to play a game, in sitting by her bed to listen to her stories, in laughing at the silly things that once seemed beneath him. These were things Maria had shown him without ever saying a word, things he realized were far more valuable than any empire he had built. Richard began to notice how differently Emily responded to him when he gave her his attention. At first, her eyes were cautious, as though she didn't believe he would stay. But when he showed up again and again, reading her favorite story, taking her into the garden, holding her hand when storms made her afraid, something inside her began to heal. Her trust returned, slowly but surely, and with it came a bond Richard had almost lost. Each smile she gave him, each laugh she shared with him, chipped away at the guilt he carried. With every passing day, he felt less like a stranger in his own daughter's life and more like the father he was always meant to be. Maria watched quietly as Richard's heart softened. She never claimed credit, never sought recognition. But Richard knew deep down that it was her influence that had awakened him. Her example of love, her quiet sacrifices, her ability to see Emily as more than her condition had opened his eyes. He realized that he had been blind not just to Emily's needs, but to Maria's humanity as well. He had dismissed her as simply an employee, someone whose role was limited to chores and tasks. Yet she had done what he could not. She had restored life to his daughter. That realization humbled him, teaching him the value of humility and gratitude in a way no business success ever could. This transformation also made Richard look at himself differently. He began to question the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. Did he want to be the businessman who built an empire, or the father who built a legacy of love? Did he want to be known for his wealth, or for the way he cherished his daughter? These questions haunted him, but they also motivated him to change. For the first time, his goals were not measured in profits but in moments. Moments with Emily, moments where love replaced absence, moments that couldn't be bought or sold. The journey wasn't perfect. There were times when old habits pulled at him, when the demands of work threatened to consume him again. There were moments when he stumbled, when his patience ran thin, when he failed to show up the way he should have. But instead of letting failure define him, he chose to keep trying. He learned that transformation wasn't about instant perfection. It was about persistence, about choosing love again and again, even when it was difficult. Each time he stumbled, he remembered the sound of Emily's laughter, the sparkle in her eyes, and he found the strength to keep going. As Richard grew, Emily grew too. Her health improved not because of medicine alone, but because of the joy and hope she now carried in her heart. She felt seen, valued, and cherished in ways she hadn't before. She began to dream again, to talk about her future, to believe that her life had meaning beyond her limitations. Richard saw this change and realized that his transformation was not just about him. It was about giving his daughter the chance to live fully, to thrive emotionally as well as physically. Through this process, Richard discovered the power of humility. He learned to say thank you to Maria, to acknowledge her sacrifices, to recognize the role she had played in his daughter's life. He realized that leadership at home was not about control but about service, not about authority but about love. It was a lesson that spilled over into his business as well, changing the way he led his employees. He became more compassionate, more human, less driven by pride and more guided by purpose. The transformation of Richard's heart was not dramatic in a single moment. It was steady, unfolding day by day. But as it deepened, it reshaped everything around him. His home was no longer silent and heavy with grief. It became filled with laughter, warmth, and love. His relationship with Emily blossomed into something beautiful, something that money could never have created. His respect for Maria grew into genuine gratitude, a recognition that sometimes the greatest teachers come from the most unexpected places. He began to see life differently. The empire he had built was still there, but it no longer defined him. What defined him was the way he showed up for his daughter, the way he chose love over ambition, presence over absence, humility over pride. What once felt impossible, balancing success with fatherhood, grief with joy, power with humility, became possible because he allowed his heart to change. The man who once thought the maid was just cleaning had discovered that she was shaping his life in ways he could never repay. The man who once thought money was everything had learned that love was greater. The man who once lived for ambition had found that true fulfillment was in the simple, tender moments he shared with his daughter. And as Richard embraced this transformation, he realized that life's greatest blessing was not what he had achieved, but who he had become.